China just slammed the brakes on Canadian oil exports, and the ripple effect is already hitting hard at home. Saskatchewan alone has nearly $4.3 billion in trade with China, a scale of exposure that Premier Scott Moe has been trying to defend during his recent trip to Beijing. Ottawa looks caught scrambling, with only token approvals like a single energy project under Bill C-5 to point to as concrete action. Meanwhile, Mark Carney has been publicly engaged with this file, even holding a June call with Chinese leadership. But his global-first focus raises doubts in the Prairies, where jobs are at stake right now. How did Canada, a country rich in energy, end up this exposed? We'll explain who loses, why Ottawa's playbook failed, and what that means as China makes its move. China makes its move. China's latest move wasn't about oil alone. It was about demonstrating how far Beijing is willing to go when it wants to send Ottawa a message. The suspension of Canadian crude is part of a clear pattern. Alongside this, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce recently dropped a 75.8% anti-dumping tariff on Canadian canola, effectively shutting that market down. Just last year, Beijing had already imposed a 100% tariff on Canadian canola oil. These are not isolated incidents, they're deliberate, targeted blows aimed at sectors that China knows have no immediate fallback markets. What triggered this? Ottawa itself sent signals by raising tariffs on Chinese steel and slapping a 100% duty on Chinese electric vehicles, moves framed as a solidarity with Washington. In practice, they exposed Canada to blowback. It lacked the strength to absorb. Beijing saw the opportunity to respond asymmetrically by punishing resource exports where Canadian provinces are most exposed, without causing lasting disruption to its own supply chains. Commentators in the research make clear that China treats Canada as an easier target than the United States or Europe, because unlike those economies, Canada doesn't have either market scale or breadth of diversified buyers to cushion the hit. That's why Beijing sees Alberta's oil and Saskatchewan's canola as pressure points. They're industries the federal government cannot easily protect, and they sustain entire communities across the prairies. When tariffs land, it isn't Ottawa that pays first. It's families, farm operators, and local businesses already under financial strain. Grain elevator bids have been dropping by about $1 a bushel, tied directly to these market disruptions. For oil, a shipment that doesn't move quickly loses value. For crops, once a major buyer like China disappears, offers sink across the board. Which provinces pay the price first? We'll get to that in a moment, but the short answer is clear: the prairies are bleeding fast. On top of that, China knows these actions ripple beyond the balance sheets. Panic doesn't start in the boardroom, it starts on the ground. A canola farmer in Manitoba or Saskatchewan doesn't want to hear about Ottawa's review committees or strategic roundtables when their bids fall 5% in a single day, as they did on the Tuesday after the tariff was announced. Oil producers in Alberta aren't interested in federal talking points while their product sits unsold. Every lost contract and every delayed payment translates directly into fewer jobs, weaker local economies, and political anger that grows sharper by the day. And Beijing is counting on exactly that kind of internal pressure to force Ottawa into concessions. This isn't random, and it's not simply punishment for punishment's sake. The Chinese strategy is consistent. They don't hit Canadian banks, auto manufacturing, or other sectors that could rebound more easily or provoke broad pushback. Instead, they zero in on canola, pork, peas, and oil. Resources that Canada has spent years leaning on without securing diverse fallback markets. These industries are provincial lifelines. Cut them off, and suddenly national stability looks fragile. That is the leverage China has been refining for more than a decade, and each new escalation demonstrates how effective it can be. The timing makes all of this even worse for Canadian producers already choking under regulatory hurdles and limited pipeline access. They had been struggling to reach markets even before Beijing's bans, and now the single largest agricultural buyer outside North America is effectively closed off. Every day of stalled sales adds up. Each week of tariffs snowballs into lost revenues and hard decisions about whether farms and small companies can carry on. That reality doesn't bend to speeches in Ottawa or long-term energy transition frameworks. It plays out in empty invoices and shrinking paychecks. The broader test here is about leadership. Chinese officials are probing whether Canada has any coherent, immediate response to protect its most vulnerable industries. Right now, what they see looks like hesitation. For Beijing, that's useful information. It confirms that punitive tariffs and suspended imports work, and it signals to other global players that Canada is a state they can squeeze without much fear of pushback. The question isn't just how long producers in Alberta and Saskatchewan can withstand these shocks. It's whether people at the federal level have the capacity, or the will, to respond with something other than cautious rhetoric. And while China is playing a calculated game of leverage, the Canadian leadership fronting the response is under growing scrutiny. The federal government has leaned on advisors and high-profile figures to calm tensions, but on the ground, that has translated into little more than minor project approvals and vague promises. The next question is whether Ottawa's chosen voices are capable of protecting Canada's economic interests, or if they're stuck offering symbolic gestures while the Prairies take the hit. Mark Carney's dilemma. Mark Carney now finds himself under a level of scrutiny he hasn't faced in years. Once celebrated as a steady hand at the Bank of England and a voice deeply connected to global financial circles, Carney is being confronted with a crisis that plays out not in headline summits, but in the fields of Saskatchewan and the oil facilities of Alberta. The familiar tools of international credibility and polished frameworks are proving harder to match with the urgency of collapsing crop bids and unsold barrels of oil at home. In this context, the approval of one Saskatchewan uranium project under Bill C-5 was rolled out as proof that Ottawa was responsive. Premier Scott Moe publicly acknowledged the step, even thanking the government for it, but producers pointed out the reality. It looked like crumbs compared to the sheer scale of the crisis. For farmers staring at steep losses and oil producers watching revenue vanish by the week, a single project simply underscored how distant Ottawa's actions were from immediate needs. Symbolism may matter in politics, but on the prairies, it isn't putting cash in contract holders' hands. Carney's defenders often point to his continued high-level engagement as evidence that he is working behind the scenes. In fact, he held a rare call in June with senior Chinese officials, the first such conversation since 2017, intended to ease tensions. Yet shortly after, Beijing went ahead with its tariffs on canola and moved forward on blocking Canadian energy shipments. The timing was not lost on producers. Calls and global positioning did not yield market access, and in the farmyards and oil fields of Western Canada, results are the only measure that matters. This is where Carney faces his dilemma. His professional identity is rooted in questions of climate finance, transitions, and shaping durable global frameworks. To foreign investors and at international conferences, that positioning may remain impressive. But to a Saskatchewan farmer with bins of unsold canola, or to oil producers calculating losses per day, that focus carries little reassurance. People want market solutions now, not plans for gradual transformation stretching decades into the future. The absence of tangible protection for commodities reinforces the perception that Ottawa's priorities are at odds with immediate survival. That divide has turned into a communication problem as well. When Ottawa talks about sustainability and regulatory adjustments while commodity bids are sliding, it deepens distrust. From a global standpoint, there is logic in preserving credibility abroad. Keeping a reputation for climate leadership and regulatory order can matter to long-term investment. But on the ground in Alberta and Saskatchewan, that logic collides with the reality of canceled contracts, surplus crops piling up, and energy producers racing to cut costs. The result is widening resentment that the federal government's most visible advisor has not matched his influence with protective measures. This tension puts Carney in a narrowing corridor of options. Redirect his weight toward domestic demands, and he risks undercutting the persona he has spent years cultivating on the global stage. Stay with the broader frameworks, and he reinforces the impression that Ottawa is content to reassure the international audience while leaving prairie industries exposed. Either route feeds discontent in some corner, and that stalemate mirrors a larger weakness in Canada's federal response to economic pressure from China. Action rarely lines up with what affected regions actually need. Perceptions, of course, turn quickly into political narratives. When Ottawa champions a project approval or speaks about long-term strategy, Western leaders counter with sharp reminders that producers are losing millions today. To them, Carney has become not just a symbol of internationalism rooted in London or Paris, but also a face tied directly to inaction where it matters most. The uranium project under Bill C-5 remains cited in Ottawa's defense, but across Saskatchewan, it is treated as more of a press release than a solution. Meanwhile, the lost billions from commodity exports keep stacking without clear offset. The stakes here extend beyond reputational bruising. If Carney and Ottawa cannot demonstrate practical relief, the distance between federal leaders and the Prairies hardens into structural distrust that may define Canada's politics for years. Every tariff imposed by Beijing pulls tangible wealth out of rural communities. Every day without alternative markets compounds the economic pressure. The gap is not just about frameworks versus urgency. It is about whether federal leadership is capable of delivering measures that protect those communities when global powers apply pressure. And that frustration has a very real focal point. The economy is directly tied to the resources now stranded. Alberta and Saskatchewan are no longer warning about hypothetical risks. They are confronting immediate losses, job cuts, and shrinking revenues. The story is no longer about whether global strategies will eventually pay off. It's about which regions of Canada are carrying the heaviest costs right now. Alberta and Saskatchewan take the hit. The sharpest economic fallout from the trade clash has landed squarely in Alberta and Saskatchewan. These provinces sit at the core of Canada's resource economy. But unlike Ontario or British Columbia, they lack the buffer of broader industry diversity. Alberta's energy producers depend on foreign buyers to keep oil moving, and Saskatchewan's canola farmers rely heavily on overseas markets to sustain income. Together, canola alone represents a $43 billion industry, with roughly 20 million acres planted across the prairies and some 40,000 farmers producing it. When China walks away, that scale of reliance translates into immediate disruption. Exports don't trickle down, they collapse, and the losses register overnight. Warnings about this exact scenario were not hidden or hypothetical. Both farmers and energy producers had told Ottawa clearly, if Canada escalated tariffs against Beijing, retaliation would hit where it hurt most resource exports that keep prairie economies alive. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe carried this urgency abroad in his trip to Beijing, mindful that Saskatchewan's trade with China is worth nearly $4.3 billion alone. From the prairies, the threats of retaliation weren't abstract. They were rooted in recent memory when China blocked pork and canola during earlier diplomatic disputes. Yet despite that track record, Ottawa pressed ahead with its tariffs. Now, the retaliation has come, and on the ground in the West, people feel that their warnings were ignored. The financial cost is personal and visible. In farming towns, producers are seeing immediate cuts to income. Ryan Hofford, a farmer in Manitoba, explained that bids at his local elevator are down roughly $1 per bushel, a drop that cost his family thousands of dollars within a single season. Multiply that kind of hit across the prairie provinces, and the numbers surge into the tens of millions lost. Even in a strong yield year, the value of production shrinks fast. Oil workers face the same kind of squeeze. Buyers know Canada has limited outlets once China pulls back, and that bargaining imbalance pushes down offers for crude oil. For producers in Alberta, those falling bids mean projects delayed, payroll trimmed, and expansion shelved indefinitely. The damage doesn't just hit farmers and rig operators, it spreads through entire communities. Small businesses in towns across Saskatchewan and Alberta depend on disposable income tied directly to oil jobs and crop sales. When farm revenue collapses or drilling slows, it reaches everything from local diners to rural banks. Restaurants report emptier tables in oil towns. Shops see fewer consistent customers in farm districts. For lenders, risk exposure rises quickly when farms and energy firms suddenly lack secure buyers. In regions without thick layers of other industries, downturns in agriculture or oil ripple outward into escalating unemployment and, in the harshest cases, shuttered local businesses. Surplus stock makes the situation worse. For a canola farmer, unsold grain fills bins fast and ties up vital cash flow. Storage isn't limitless, and holding excess stock brings maintenance costs on top of lost revenue. Oil companies face a similar dynamic, though in their case, unsold capacity means deliberately slowing production, idling rigs, and laying off workers to avoid pumping product that can't find a profitable buyer. While Ottawa promotes long-term green investment funds and climate goals, producers look at invoices and unpaid bills waiting at the door. For them, future-focused programs don't answer the immediate question of whether their harvest or shipments can be sold at all this season. That frustration explains the tone coming out of the West. To farmers and oil producers, Alberta and Saskatchewan are paying for a national trade fight they did not provoke, and the scale of the consequences was obvious before the conflict escalated. There were no meaningful safeguards put in place, no true diversification efforts ready to soften the blow. What stands out across the prairies is the sense that policy choices in Ottawa leave their communities footing the bill while officials in the capital talk about abstract future transitions. They see economic lifelines fraying, communities forced to trim back every expense, and yet no direct solutions that restore access to the markets they've lost. The imbalance has deepened into resentment because each day without replacement, buyers leaves more grain in the bins, more projects abandoned, and more families asking how long their operations can survive under these conditions. As this pressure compounds, another set of barriers looms large. Producers are not only contending with China's retaliation, they're also dealing with Ottawa's own rules and processes that choke off potential recovery. And that is where the next layer of the crisis begins to take shape. The damage in Alberta and Saskatchewan is severe, but it's being amplified by another problem, the red tape that keeps these provinces from pivoting quickly when they're hit. The regulatory bottleneck. Energy and agriculture producers point to something bigger than tariffs when explaining why they feel boxed in. The regulatory bottleneck at home. In their view, projects that could create more capacity to reach alternate buyers are stuck in endless approval processes. Whether it's a pipeline, a port upgrade, a new rail corridor, a processing plant, or even a uranium mine, proposals wind their way through years of federal reviews. What looks like due diligence in Ottawa often looks like paralysis on the prairies. The result is billions of dollars in potential investment stalled out, while communities wait on approvals that may never come. This isn't theory. It's the daily reality for industries losing money while projects remain trapped on paper. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe has pushed hard on this, saying that every project that has any federal approval should be included under streamlining reforms like Bill C-5. One uranium project did receive approval earlier this year under that law, something Moe acknowledged as progress, but he was blunt. One project moving forward means very little when dozens more are stalled. For local workers and producers, the difference between rhetoric and reality is measured in jobs that exist versus jobs that stay hypothetical. The bottleneck magnified the blow of China's retaliation. Producers argue they could weather tariffs or suspended imports if more infrastructure existed to diversify supply chains. Without new pipelines, upgraded ports, or expanded rail, exports remain overexposed to a single buyer like China. That means any disruption triggers losses on a massive scale. By the time Ottawa completes environmental panels or launches roundtables, farm bids have already collapsed, shipments have been delayed for entire harvests, and oil producers have already pulled rigs offline. Bureaucracy pulls in one direction, while markets move at another pace entirely. The contrast with the U.S. has become a common talking point in the West. Background research and provincial leaders both argue that American projects clear faster, giving U.S. producers more agility to compete globally. Ottawa insists its system protects environmental and community interests. But from a prairie perspective, the outcome is simple. By the time Canada finishes approving one project, American producers have already signed contracts and secured new markets. Whether Ottawa likes the comparison or not, prairie leaders are using it as a measure of just how far behind Canada has fallen. And the damage doesn't stop at lost revenue. In global trade, reliability is currency. Foreign buyers want certainty. If a Saskatchewan or Alberta producer can't guarantee delivery because projects are stuck in review, the customer hesitates and often looks elsewhere. Investors read that hesitation too. Uncertainty about Canada's regulatory system pushes capital into markets where approvals are clearer and timelines more predictable. What starts as a bottleneck ends up as a drain on investor confidence, further entrenching the cycle of stalled projects and missed opportunities. This frustration hits hardest because the opportunities already existed. Pipelines that could have helped shift exports away from China remain unfinished. Port upgrades that might have supported faster diversification are still tied up. Rail expansions that could have moved prairie commodities more efficiently are decades overdue. The missed infrastructure isn't just a minor inconvenience, it's the difference between resilience and fragility. When China retaliated, Canada had no backup routes ready to cushion the blow. Provinces like Saskatchewan have made their prescription very clear: cut the red tape and expand Bill C-5 so that every project seeking federal approval can move forward. Mo has repeated that line in meetings with Beijing and in statements at home, arguing that regulatory reform isn't just abstract, it's an immediate economic defense against the kind of trade shocks producers are living through. For him and for producers in the region, regulatory bottlenecks aren't neutral safeguards. They are barriers that keep communities dependent and prevent Canada from defending itself in the global market. This structural weakness is what makes foreign pressure so effective. It isn't only that China suspended oil imports or slapped tariffs on canola. It's that Canada entered this dispute without the capacity to pivot, leaving prairie producers boxed in. By slowing approvals, Ottawa reinforced the very vulnerabilities Beijing is exploiting. That dynamic has created anger across the West, but also raised a bigger question about Ottawa's role, not just in the domestic economy, but in global positioning when trade disputes escalate. Because what happens in Ottawa doesn't stay in Ottawa. These bottlenecks ripple onto the world stage, shaping how Canada appears to buyers, rivals, and allies alike. And in the middle of a dispute where Beijing's retaliation collides with Washington's trade battles, Canada's constraints aren't just internal, they're geopolitical. Geopolitical chessboard. On the global stage, Canada's trade dispute with China is not just a bilateral fight. It is a move on the geopolitical chessboard where Ottawa chose alignment over independence. By mirroring Washington's tariffs on Chinese imports, specifically the duties on steel and the 100% tariff on electric vehicles, Canada effectively signaled loyalty to its largest ally. Provincial critics argue this was a calculated risk that ignored Canada's weaker economic position. Commentators point out that the U.S. economy is large enough to absorb retaliations, whereas Canada does not have the same cushion. In Washington, one industry can falter while another sector picks up the slack. In Ottawa, there are fewer buffers. That difference matters when Beijing decides to respond. The retaliation came both quickly and with surgical precision. Beijing did not spread its measures across broad sectors. Instead, it struck directly at canola and crude oil, industries that Canada relies on but has few alternate markets for. The 75.8% anti-dumping tariff on Canadian canola devastated prairie farmers, added on top of last year's 100% tariff on canola oil, reducing bids at grain elevators almost immediately. At the same time, China suspended oil shipments, a punishment tailored to Alberta's most vulnerable industry. Meanwhile, negotiations and trade with the United States continued for Beijing, underscoring how selective the strategy was. China knew Ottawa had followed Washington's lead, but they also knew punishing the U.S. carried higher risks. That contrast sends its own message. The cost of alignment falls squarely on Canadian producers, not on American multinationals. Even at the highest levels, Ottawa was unable to blunt the retaliation. Mark Carney himself joined a June call with senior Chinese officials, the first such conversation in years, reportedly seeking to ease tensions. Yet soon after, China proceeded with new tariffs and suspended imports anyway. For prairie farmers and oil workers, the result spoke louder than the diplomacy. They saw no relief, only a worsening of the crisis. Instead of reassuring them, it confirmed what many had already suspected. Canada does not hold meaningful leverage in this game. For Beijing, the retaliation not only demonstrated strength to Ottawa, but also sent a broader warning to other middle powers: align with Washington, and China can weaponize trade against you in ways that matter most to your local economies. This broader signaling is at the heart of China's strategy. By targeting Canada, Beijing proves a point both domestically and internationally. The message is simple: they can punish smaller economies without facing significant blowback. This doesn't just pressure Canadian leaders, it speaks to Europe, Australia, and others who might consider similar tariff moves. It telegraphs that stepping into a U.S.-China trade dispute carries costs far heavier for smaller economies than for Washington itself. At the same time, it highlights something else. Canada's claim to global influence looks thinner when tested. International speeches and climate forums may project ambition, but when a trade war unfolds, market losses become the real indicator of a country's standing. Ottawa can argue about transition pathways or global cooperation, but for farmers and oil producers, the evidence is in sinking bids and idle rigs. From Washington's perspective, this vulnerability complicates the alliance. If the U.S. sees its closest partner taking repeated hits without tools to defend itself, doubts arise. Is Canada a reliable trading ally, or is it a junior partner that adds symbolic support while carrying little weight in negotiations? Beijing understands this dynamic. Their strategy exploits it, aiming not only at prairie industries, but also at the credibility of Ottawa on the world stage. It fractures trust with producers at home and tests Ottawa's value to its allies abroad. For middle powers, this is what trade pressure really achieves. It divides internal constituencies while undermining external relationships. For Canada, the power gap remains obvious. Every tariff, every suspended shipment from China lays bare the country's limited capacity to retaliate or pivot quickly. Farmers in the West are now living with the fallout. Oil companies face shrinking revenues and paused projects, not because of mismanagement at home, but because their market access is a bargaining chip in a clash of giants. The frustration is deeper than politics. It reflects a structural weakness in national policy. Provinces are asked to carry the economic weight, while Ottawa positions itself as aligned with Washington but limited in its ability to offset the losses that follow. This is why provincial leaders keep framing the confrontation as less about alignment and more about exposure. They argue that Ottawa approached the board game with few pieces left to move, while Washington played with real leverage. Middle powers can't bluff their way through economic wars, and Beijing knows it. For Canada, the dispute may have started with tariffs, but the consequences extend beyond short-term trade costs. It is a live demonstration of how vulnerable prairie economies become when federal choices prioritize geopolitical alignment without parallel domestic protections. And this is where the pressure shifts. What China chose to take off the table, Alberta's oil, Saskatchewan's canola, isn't just about current market access. It sets the stage for what comes next. The questions facing producers and policymakers now go beyond retaliation. They point toward a deeper issue: the long-term future of Canada's energy and resource industries in a market environment where allies may back Ottawa politically, but not shield it economically. What this means for Canada's energy future. The suspension of Canadian oil exports to China throws a spotlight on a much larger issue: what path Canada is going to take for its energy future. This is not just a temporary interruption in trade. It raises questions about whether the country has a credible plan to protect its producers when a key buyer steps away. Right now, Alberta's rigs and Saskatchewan's farms are scrambling to find alternatives. But replacing China as a customer is not just about signing new sales agreements. Without pipelines to both coasts, modernized port facilities, and faster approvals for major projects, Canada simply doesn't have the infrastructure to shift energy and commodities to new markets at scale. Producers and premiers have been saying the same thing. Market diversification can only happen if the country finally prioritizes building the systems that allow goods to move. The problem producers face is that potential new buyers are not going to wait around. Provinces stress that other markets exist, but reaching them takes years of investment in transport routes and export hubs. While competitors, most notably the United States, expand capacity and secure contracts quickly, Canadian producers are left behind. Ottawa's slow pace of approvals underlines the challenge. Despite the creation of Bill C-5 to smooth out processes, only one project has been actively moved forward, leaving dozens still stalled. Officials in Saskatchewan argue that every project with a federal approval component should come under a streamlined framework. Without that kind of reform, pipelines, rail expansions, and processing plants remain on hold, and billions in potential trade flow right past Canada to rival suppliers. Global competition only reinforces how exposed Canada is. The United States, with a far larger industry and more agile approval systems, keeps grabbing new market share. It can move quickly because projects are advanced without the delays Canadian producers face. That difference leaves Ottawa in a bind. It cannot match American speed, but without faster processes of its own, it risks falling further behind. For producers who already lost access to China, this disadvantage could mean more than just reduced sales. It could make them non-competitive on the world stage altogether. And once Canada develops a reputation as an unreliable or blocked supplier, winning back credibility is almost impossible. This leads into the deeper divide between Ottawa and the provinces. The federal government pushes long-term climate targets and transition planning as its core narrative. Albertans and Saskatchewanians, meanwhile, argue they are fighting for the survival of their industries and jobs today. From their perspective, Ottawa's climate frameworks may influence investment decades from now, but collapsing bids and idle rigs are happening this season. This split is not just about politics. It creates paralysis among investors who see uncertainty about whether Canada is even committed to an energy future beyond domestic transition goals. If investors cannot predict where policy will land, they are reluctant to put capital into the very projects that could strengthen resilience. The longer this conflict persists, the more likely Canada risks being sidelined entirely in conversations about global energy supply. Buyers and investors want confidence that their partners can ship on time, at scale, and consistently. Every delay in pipelines or ports chips away at that trust. Every month lost to regulatory review hands an opening to a U.S. competitor that can make decisions faster. If policy contradictions remain unresolved, Canada doesn't just risk lost revenue this year, it could find itself dropped off the priority list for contracts that shape the next decade of trade. And once you lose that place at the table, it is not easily won back. There is a path forward, but it requires the kinds of reforms provincial leaders have already put on the record. Saskatchewan's Premier Scott Moe and others insist that regulatory reform must go further, expanding Bill C-5, treating provinces as true partners, and recognizing that pipelines, rail, and port facilities are not optional add-ons. They are the backbone of a sustainable energy strategy. Without them, attempts to diversify remain empty promises. Without faster approvals, capital keeps fleeing. The question is whether Ottawa treats these demands as optional rhetoric or accepts them as essential national strategy. This crisis has done more than reveal cracks. It has exposed just how vulnerable Canada's energy future is when infrastructure lags and policy conflicts stall progress. The resources exist. The producers are ready. What is missing is the system to back them, and the political commitment to balance climate objectives with immediate economic survival. The danger is that if Ottawa continues with delays, Canada will not just lose a buyer, it will lose credibility as a seller altogether. And that leads directly to the question Canadians have to face. If Ottawa doesn't act to fix approvals and build the necessary infrastructure, will Canada lose market credibility and, with it, a decade of energy opportunity? Conclusion. China's suspension of oil imports has left Alberta and Saskatchewan carrying the heaviest losses, exposing how federal trade choices ripple hardest through the Prairies. These frontline provinces are paying for decisions made in Ottawa without the tools to defend themselves. Critics in the coverage warned that the Prairies will keep paying the price unless Ottawa reforms, by expanding Bill C-5, cutting red tape, and diversifying markets before the next retaliation arrives. The prescription has been clear, but the leadership gap remains. So tell me what you think. Should Ottawa hold control over approvals, or should provinces take the lead? Comment Ottawa if you believe federal leadership matters most, or provinces if you think the West should shape its own future.